Jason Hale's office was immaculate, a picture of corporate power and control. The glass walls overlooked the sprawling city of Tirius below, where the gleaming towers of his company dominated the skyline. The hum of machinery below was a constant reminder of the labor that powered his empire. But inside his high-rise, the world was neatly ordered, precise. Just like him. He sat at his polished, black marble desk, a sleek tablet in front of him showing charts and figures. Numbers that were all he ever needed to think about. His empire was thriving, but even now, something gnawed at him. It was a feeling he didn't often indulge, but it refused to let him go. The latest reports from his company's regional offices had mentioned rising complaints from the workers, the people who manned the factories, the ones who brought his vision to life. They'd been growing bolder, sending anonymous messages to the media, warning of dangerous working conditions. The complaints were increasing, and Jason had brushed them aside as typical worker dissatisfaction. He had no time for sentimentality. Workers were a means to an end, essential, yes, but ultimately replaceable. A few accidents here and there were to be expected in a high-stakes environment. He had always been pragmatic about it. Yet, when the reports piled up in his inbox this time, something made him hesitate. The meeting had been a perfect display of power, a tight circle of the board members listening as Jason outlined his plans for future expansion. But as the meeting ended, his second-in-command, Karen, pulled him aside with a worried look on her face. "Jason," she began, a rare note of concern in her voice. "There's been a spike in worker injuries again. We're getting heat from the press. The unions are talking." Jason, his eyes sharp and unreadable, flicked a glance toward her. "Are we talking about a few isolated incidents? Or is this a serious problem?" "Serious enough to cause public backlash," Karen replied. "The safety protocols aren't being followed in some of the outer factories. I've seen the reports. Workers are asking for more oversight, and it's starting to look like a liability." Jason's jaw tightened. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "You know the drill. We deal with problems when they become a real threat, not before. Make sure the PR team is on top of it. If it's just noise, we'll wait it out." But Karen's expression didn't change. "This time it's different, Jason. I've seen the reports firsthand. People are getting hurt, and management is covering it up." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Jason found himself uncertain. He waved a hand dismissively. "I'll handle it, but I don't have time for distractions. I have a company to run." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "I'll look into it. Make sure it doesn't escalate." When Jason returned to his penthouse that evening, the weight of Karen's words stayed with him. He'd never been one to let concerns about workers affect his judgment. It was all about profits, expansion, and growth. Yet, there was something about the idea of unchecked corruption, about the vulnerability of his empire that didn't sit right. Sitting at his polished desk, Jason accessed the confidential reports that Karen had mentioned, scanning through the complaints. Hazardous chemicals, cracked machinery, unsafe working hours. And then, the worst of all, several workers had recently disappeared, their whereabouts unknown. His pulse quickened. The company was too big to fail, but if something went wrong, if the wrong people started speaking out, his empire could crumble. Jason stared at the data for a long time, until a thought struck him. He needed to see it for himself. He couldn't rely on second-hand reports anymore. The truth could be worse than anyone had imagined. And if it was, he'd need to act fast to contain it. The next day, Jason put a plan into motion. He would go undercover. Not many knew what he looked like in public. As far as the employees were concerned, the CEO was a distant figure, an almost mythical presence. He could disappear into the ranks of the employees, observe from the inside, and gather the information he needed to eliminate any potential threats before they went public. He arranged everything in secret, changing his appearance, hiring a fake identity, and securing a low-level position at one of the factories. He would become a mere cog in the machine, blending in unnoticed. No one would suspect the CEO was standing right under their noses. With his mind set, Jason boarded a shuttle to one of the remote factories on the outskirts of Tirius. It was a far cry from the polished headquarters he was used to, The air was heavy with industrial fumes, the sky perpetually overcast from the smog of the factories. The workers, mostly alien species, moved about in a mechanical routine, their faces gaunt and tired. Jason's heart sank at the sight, but he hid it well behind his carefully constructed mask of indifference. He arrived under the false name Jake Miller, a new technician assigned to the floor. The factory was massive, with towering machines that hummed incessantly, the walls lined with metal panels that reflected the dim light. He was introduced to his new team, a ragtag group of workers who barely looked up from their tasks. No one seemed to recognize him, and Jason took comfort in that. His eyes scanned the factory floor, taking in the details. The workers seemed exhausted, moving quickly but with a distinct lack of motivation. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken but palpable. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of hope. Jason could feel it in the way they moved, the way they avoided eye contact. Then, his gaze fell on Kyra, a striking alien woman who stood at the center of the factory. Unlike the others, she carried herself with purpose and resolve, organizing her fellow workers, directing them with calm authority. Her skin was a soft shade of teal, her eyes a brilliant shade of yellow that glowed faintly in the dim light. There was a certain grace to her, despite the grueling labor. Jason's gaze lingered longer than he intended. There was something about her, something that drew him in. As Kyra approached him, her expression was one of cautious curiosity. "You're new," she said, her voice low but firm. "Name's Kyra. You'll need to keep up." Jason forced a smile, trying to hide the unease that bubbled inside him. "Jake," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I'm just here to help out." Her eyes scanned him for a moment before she nodded and moved on, barking orders to the other workers. Jason's eyes followed her as she walked away, a sense of unease creeping over him. He wasn't prepared for the weight of her presence, nor the strange sense of guilt he felt, knowing he was hiding the truth. For the first time in years, Jason felt like an outsider. He forced the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. But something inside him had shifted. The reality of the workers' lives, their struggles, was starting to take root. And he hadn't even begun to scratch the surface yet. Jason had expected the factory to be noisy, chaotic, and inefficient. But nothing could have prepared him for the palpable heaviness in the air. The workers moved with robotic precision, their faces drained of energy, their eyes dulled by the grind of endless labor. He stood on the edge of the floor, a silent observer, as his mind processed the reality of the system he had built. Kyra moved through the crowd like a quiet force, offering encouragement and small words of support to her fellow workers. Jason watched her closely as she spoke with a man in his late 30s, a human who appeared as though the weight of his life had settled permanently in his shoulders. Kyra's voice was soft but firm, and there was an understanding in her eyes that seemed to spark something within him. He had been in power for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to be a part of something, to rely on others. But Kyra, she was different. She commanded respect not through authority alone, but through compassion, something Jason had long neglected. "Jake," Kyra called out, snapping him from his thoughts. "I need you on assembly line 2. Keep the pace steady. We can't afford mistakes." Jason nodded, taking a step toward the line as she instructed. The noise of the factory, the clanking of metal and the hum of machines, was overwhelming at first. His new role required him to keep the machines running smoothly, an ironic task for someone who had once ordered others to make decisions without ever getting their hands dirty. He had spent so many years in the luxury of boardrooms that the physical work felt foreign to him. As the hours dragged on, Jason fell into a rhythm. He performed the work mechanically like the other employees, but his mind never stopped. The longer he spent on the factory floor, the more questions and concerns flooded his thoughts. How had things gotten so bad? Why was the system so broken? When his shift finally ended, Jason made his way toward the employee lounge, his muscles sore from tasks he had never thought twice about overseeing from his high-rise office. He wasn't used to feeling tired in this way, and he couldn't help but notice how different it was here. There were no cushioned chairs or silk ties, just hard metal benches and the scent of sweat and machinery in the air. Kyra was sitting by herself at one of the far tables, her head tilted downward as she scrolled through a small, outdated device. Jason hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should approach her, but his curiosity got the better of him. He walked over and sat down across from her, offering a tentative smile. "You look like you could use a break," he said, trying to sound casual. Kyra didn't look up immediately. She continued scrolling through her device, her fingers quick and efficient, as though she was seeking something. When she finally met his eyes, her expression was unreadable. "I don't have time for breaks," she replied quietly, her voice not unkind but distant. "But you should probably take one while you can. You're not used to this, are you?" Jason smirked, attempting to mask his discomfort. "I've been here a couple of hours. I can handle it." She raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Instead, she went back to her device, her brow furrowing as she read something. Jason watched her for a moment longer, trying to decipher the strange sense of admiration that seemed to grow within him. There was something about her that pulled at him, a sense of strength and resilience that he had long lost sight of in his corporate bubble. After a beat, Kyra set the device down and leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "You're new here," she said, her voice carrying a trace of suspicion. "But you don't seem like the type who's here to stay. What's your story, Jake?" Jason swallowed, taken aback by her directness. He knew he couldn't reveal the truth. Not yet, not while he was still undercover. Instead, he shrugged, keeping his voice casual. "I'm just looking for something different," he said, trying to make his words sound unremarkable. "I heard about the company and thought I'd give it a shot. No harm in seeing things from the ground up, right?" Kyra seemed to consider this for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was trying to gauge his sincerity. After a long silence, she nodded and leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Don't get too comfortable," she said, her words quiet but serious. "Things here aren't what they seem. I've been working for this company for years, and I've seen a lot of things get swept under the rug. The higher-ups don't care about us. We're just numbers to them." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He had heard whispers of discontent, but hearing it from someone so close to the source struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He studied her face, watching as her jaw tightened, her eyes filled with a mix of defiance and resignation. "You seem like you know what you're talking about," he said, keeping his tone light. "I guess I'm still getting used to it." Kyra smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "That's what they want you to think. The company sells you this idea of hard work paying off, but all it does is take from you. Most of us will never make it to the top. And the ones who do, they forget about us the moment they get what they want." Jason felt a pang of guilt. He had always known that corporate life wasn't fair, but hearing Kyra's words, seeing her expression, made him feel the weight of it more than he ever had before. It wasn't just about workers and profits. It was about lives, real people who had been reduced to mere assets in a game. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Jason said, his voice uncharacteristically sincere. Kyra shrugged, a flicker of something softer passing across her face before it hardened again. "It's not about how I feel. It's about what we do with it. You've got a chance to make things right here, Jake. You could do something. Or you could walk away like everyone else." Jason remained silent for a long moment, the words hanging in the air between them. He had never thought of himself as a hero, and yet something about Kyra's unspoken challenge stirred something inside him. He had always been a man of action, of control. But here, surrounded by these workers, he felt powerless. Kyra stood up, brushing off her jumpsuit. "You'll figure it out. Just don't get too attached. It's not worth it." Before Jason could respond, she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Her words echoed in his mind as he sat back, his gaze following her retreating figure. He knew she was right, he could walk away, but something told him that walking away wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Jason's days on the factory floor blended together into a monotonous rhythm, each one feeling like the last. He woke up before dawn, traveled to the outskirts of Tirius, and donned his disguise. The work was hard, physical, Nothing like the cushioned, strategic decisions he was accustomed to in the sleek offices of his empire. But it was also revealing. Every day, the cracks in the system grew more apparent. And every day, Jason found himself growing more attached to Kyra. She was a force of nature. The way she commanded the floor with ease. She didn't shout like the others. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough to draw the workers' respect. Jason couldn't help but be drawn to her. Her quiet confidence. The way she moved through the factory like she was carrying a weight much heavier than anyone else could see. And yet, she never faltered. It was on the fourth day that he began to see the cracks in her armor. Jason was assigned to work alongside her in a section of the factory where workers handled hazardous chemicals. The air was thick with fumes, and the machinery hummed incessantly in the background. Kyra was moving between workstations, offering guidance and support, her face composed but strained. Jason noticed that her shoulders were tense, her movements precise but a little too quick, as though she was avoiding something. After an hour of working side by side, Jason took a risk. He approached her as she was overseeing a worker who had trouble with a machine. "You don't have to do this alone, Kyra," he said, his voice softer than usual. She didn't look up from the worker, though Jason could see her jaw tighten. "I'm used to it," she replied, not meeting his gaze. Jason hesitated, then took a step closer, his voice low. "I don't mean just this job. I mean everything." Kyra paused for a moment, her hand stilling on the worker's arm. The brief hesitation was enough for Jason to realize that perhaps he had crossed a line. But before he could retract his words, she finally looked up at him, her yellow eyes searching his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone sharper now, though not unkind. Jason held her gaze, trying to steady his thoughts. "You don't have to carry all of this on your own," he repeated. "Whatever it is that's weighing on you, you don't have to do it alone." There was a long silence between them, and for a moment, Jason wasn't sure if she would brush him off or snap at him. But instead, she let out a slow breath and stepped back, leading him away from the worker they had been helping. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though Jason could see the lie in her eyes. "I just have a lot on my plate." Jason couldn't help but feel that there was more she wasn't saying. He wanted to press further, to ask what exactly she was hiding, but he held back. Something told him that pushing her too hard would only push her further away. Instead, he nodded and changed the subject. "Well, let me know if you need anything. I'm here to help too." Kyra's eyes softened, and for the first time, Jason saw a flicker of gratitude in them. She gave a small, genuine smile, though it was quickly masked by her usual guarded expression. "Thanks, Jake, but I'm used to handling things on my own." Jason let it go, but the conversation lingered with him long after their shift ended. There was something about Kyra that intrigued him, something that made him want to break through the walls she had built around herself. But he couldn't do it by force, and it became clear that she wasn't the type to open up easily. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Jason worked diligently beside Kyra, but the conversations remained surface level. There was still a professional distance between them, though Jason couldn't ignore the growing connection. He found himself noticing little things about her. How her movements seemed more fluid when she was focused, the way her lips pressed into a thin line when she was frustrated, and the rare moments when she let her guard down, just for a second. It was on the seventh day that Jason was assigned to a new task, to work with a smaller team on a machinery overhaul. The work was more complex, requiring specialized knowledge and attention to detail. He found himself paired with Kyra again, but this time, there was no pleasantry between them. She didn't speak much, only guiding him through the technical steps of the job with minimal words. As the hours stretched on, Jason found the silence between them growing heavier. The work was intense, but Jason couldn't help but feel the tension that had begun to build. Something had shifted in Kyra. He could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly when she adjusted a piece of machinery, or the way her eyes darted nervously toward the other workers. Finally, Jason spoke up. "Kyra, what's going on?" he asked, his voice softer than before. "You've been off lately. If something's bothering you, Before he could finish, she snapped, her voice cutting through the air. "I said I'm fine." she shot back, her eyes flashing with something Jason couldn't quite decipher. Just focus on your work, Jake. I don't need your pity. Jason stepped back, momentarily stunned by her outburst. For a moment, he almost regretted pressing her. But then something inside him pushed him to take another step forward. I'm not offering pity, Kyra, he said firmly, his voice steady. I just want to help. But if you're not ready to talk, that's fine. I can wait. Kyra looked at him, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For a long time she said nothing, but the walls around her seemed to crack, just a little. I'm not the person you think I am, Jake, she finally murmured. I've been here for years, trying to make this place better. But it's like I'm fighting a losing battle. I can't keep up. I can't do it anymore. Jason's heart clenched at her words. He had seen the way she worked, the way she carried herself with so much responsibility. He hadn't realized how much weight she had been bearing alone. You don't have to carry it all, Kyra, Jason said again, softer this time. We're in this together. She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she turned away, her eyes trained on the machinery. Jason waited, sensing that she wasn't ready to reveal everything. But as he watched her, he realized that he couldn't just walk away from this. Something about her had awakened something in him, a desire to make things right. Not just for the workers, but for her. The moment stretched on, thick with unsaid words. Jason knew that this was only the beginning of something deeper, something that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about the world he had built. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth, but he was determined to find it. Kyra, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I'll be here no matter what. She finally looked at him, her eyes soft but wary. For a brief moment, he thought she might say something that would finally break down the walls between them. But instead, she simply nodded, her lips pressing together in a thin line. And then, just as quickly, she turned back to her work. The moment had passed, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that it had only just begun. The following days were a blur of shifts, work, and unspoken tension between Jason and Kyra. They still worked side by side on the factory floor, though there was an unspoken understanding between them. Kyra's walls remained firmly in place, but Jason was beginning to understand just how much she had buried deep inside. She never spoke about her struggles, her disappointments, or the countless frustrations that she carried with her. But it was written all over her face when she thought no one was looking. It had been 2 weeks since Jason had started his undercover assignment, and though he was learning more each day about the inner workings of the company, the changes he sought felt too small. The bureaucracy, the greed that had consumed the corporation, was far more complicated than he had anticipated. The deeper he dug, the more questions arose, ones that didn't have easy answers. But even in the midst of all the corporate red tape and invisible forces pulling at him from every direction, Kyra remained his focus. Despite her guarded nature, he was seeing a different side of her, one that made his heart ache in ways he didn't fully understand. Her quiet strength was magnetic, her resilience something he couldn't ignore. She had told him once that she was used to fighting alone, but Jason was beginning to believe that if he could show her that she didn't have to, she might start believing it herself. One afternoon, while they were working near the assembly line, Jason had noticed something different about Kyra. She was still carrying out her duties efficiently, but her movements were more agitated, quicker than usual. Her face was taut, her jaw clenched. Jason observed her from the corner of his eye, a deepening sense of concern growing within him. He knew better than to ask outright. Kyra had made it clear that she wasn't interested in talking about her problems, but something told him she needed to open up. Without a word, Jason moved to stand beside her, positioning himself in a way that didn't interrupt her work, but allowed him to keep her in his peripheral vision. When she finally turned to him, her face showed a flash of surprise, but she quickly masked it. Jake, what are you doing here? Her voice was tight, her usual calm replaced with something almost like anxiety. I thought you were scheduled for another part of the floor today. Jason shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. I finished early. Thought I'd come see how you're holding up. Her gaze flickered, and for the first time, She seemed to hesitate before responding. I am Fina. Jason wasn't convinced. He had learned that when Kyra said she was fine, it often meant the opposite. He stepped a little closer, keeping his voice low, almost as if sharing a secret. You don't have to do this alone, you know? He said, his tone soft but sincere. I'm here. If you need help or if you need someone to talk to. Kyra's expression tightened at his words, and for a moment, she looked away, her eyes scanning the workers around them. Her shoulders tensed, her breath quickening slightly. Jason could tell she was fighting an internal battle, weighing her options. You don't get it? She muttered, almost to herself. It's not that simple. Jason's heart clenched. There was so much more to her than the stoic, businesslike exterior she presented. She was stronger than anyone he had ever met, but he could see how hard she was trying to hold everything together. She was breaking just a little. Before he could respond, the factory manager, Thorne, appeared, a hulking presence that immediately shifted the energy in the room. Jason had seen Thorne before, but hadn't interacted with him much. He was one of the higher-ups, though Jason had no doubt that he had little regard for the workers on the floor. Thorne's eyes flickered over Kyra and Jason for a moment before he spoke. Kyra, I need you to supervise the new batch of equipment coming in. There's a delay, and I don't want any mistakes. You know the drill. Jason could see the way Kyra stiffened, but she didn't argue. She nodded curtly and turned away, moving briskly toward the designated area. Thorne's gaze lingered on her for a beat longer than necessary, before he turned to walk away. Jason watched her go, the knot in his chest tightening. It was clear that something was wrong, but every time he tried to get close, Kyra pushed him away, as though she didn't want him to see the cracks she was so desperately trying to hide. He followed her to the equipment area, keeping a few paces behind. She was bending over a control panel, her hands working quickly, but her body language was tense. Jason stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, unsure of what to do next. He could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them, the tension in the air like static. Kyra, he said, finally breaking the silence. She didn't look up at first, but he could see her body stiffen at the sound of his voice. I don't want to keep pushing you, he continued, his tone soft. But you don't have to keep hiding everything from me. I can help. Let me in, Kyra. There was a long pause before she slowly stood up, her back to him as she faced the machinery. For a moment, Jason thought she might ignore him. But then she turned, her yellow eyes meeting his with a rawness he hadn't seen before. There was a flicker of vulnerability in them, something he didn't think Kyra was willing to show anyone. I'm not hiding anything, she said, her voice low but shaky. But I don't need help. Not from you. Not from anyone. Jason didn't move. He wasn't sure what had shifted, but something in her tone told him that she was close to breaking. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he could feel the gravity of the situation. If he pushed too hard now, he risked losing her completely. But if he didn't push at all, she would remain trapped in her own silent struggle. I don't care if you don't need help, Jason said, his voice firm but gentle. You don't have to carry it all, Kyra. You don't have to keep everything bottled up. She was silent for a long time, and just when Jason thought she might walk away again, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't make promises you can't keep, Jake, she said, her eyes dropping to the floor. I'm not someone you can save, and I don't want to be saved. The words struck Jason like a physical blow, but he didn't retreat. He stood there, his heart racing, knowing that this was the moment where everything could change. I'm not trying to save you, Jason said quietly. I just want to be here. For you. If you'll let me. Kyra's gaze flickered up to his again, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. No walls, no defenses. Just two people caught in the tension of an unspoken truth. But before either of them could say more, a loud crash echoed from across the room, pulling them both out of their moment. They both turned toward the sound, and Jason saw a piece of machinery had malfunctioned, sending sparks flying in all directions. Without a word, Kyra moved swiftly, her instincts kicking in. Jason followed her, adrenaline coursing through him. They worked together in silence, fighting to contain the damage. But in that moment, amidst the chaos, Jason realized that the fight wasn't just against the malfunctioning machines. It was against the deeper, more dangerous flaws that were festering within the company. And Kyra, though she didn't yet know it, had become the key to everything. The aftermath of the equipment failure lingered in the air like a cloud of smoke. Though the immediate danger had passed, Kyra had been the first to react, her hands moving swiftly to shut down the malfunctioning machinery. Her voice calm and clear as she directed the workers to safety. Jason had helped where he could, his pulse still racing from the adrenaline. Once the area was cleared, Kyra stood at the center of the chaos, her eyes scanning the scene, her expression unreadable. The workers had already started to return to their tasks, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Jason felt it too. This moment felt different, heavier. The sparks from the malfunctioning equipment had ignited something else, something deeper between them. Jason approached Kyra carefully, his steps slow and deliberate. She was staring at the control panel, her face hard, the earlier vulnerability replaced with the familiar, guarded mask. He could tell she was replaying the incident in her mind, analyzing it, blaming herself for not catching the issue sooner. "You did what you had to do," Jason said, his voice steady. "No one got hurt. That's what matters." Kyra didn't respond immediately. Her jaw was set, and her fists were clenched by her sides. Jason could see the tightness in her posture, the tension that still hadn't dissipated. She was holding something back, something more than just the stress of the malfunction. "I should have caught it sooner," Kyra finally said, her voice tight with frustration. "If I had been paying more attention, this wouldn't have happened." Jason shook his head. "No one could have predicted that. These machines are old. They break down. It's not your fault." She met his gaze then, her yellow eyes sharp, almost defiant. "You don't understand," she muttered, her voice low but intense. "Every mistake here costs someone something, and I can't keep watching people pay the price for my failures." Jason took a step closer, his eyes softening. He wanted to say something that would reassure her, something that would break through the walls she had built around herself. But the words didn't come. Instead, he found himself simply standing there, watching her, waiting for her to open up. "I'm not going to let you carry this alone," he finally said, his voice firm. "Not anymore." Kyra's expression faltered for the briefest moment, but it was enough for Jason to see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to trust him, he could tell, but she was scared. Scared of what might happen if she let herself be vulnerable, if she allowed someone else in. She looked away, rubbing her temples with her fingers. "You don't know what it's like to be here every day, Jake. To watch everything fall apart and know that no matter how hard you try, it's never enough. I'm tired." Jason took another step forward, his heart aching at her words. She was breaking little by little, and he was starting to understand the weight she carried. She wasn't just a worker in the factory. She was a survivor, a fighter who had been ground down by a system that didn't care about her or anyone like her. "I know you're tired," Jason said gently, "but you don't have to do it all by yourself. I'm here, Kyra. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Kyra didn't respond. She simply stood there, her shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the floor. Jason could feel the pull between them, a connection that neither of them had been able to ignore. He didn't know what it was exactly, but he couldn't help but feel that she was slowly letting him in, just a little bit. "Why do you keep saying that?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you keep offering to help me?" Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was the moment. He had to tell her. He had to take the risk. "Because I care about you, Kyra," he said, his voice steady. "I care about you, and I don't want to see you keep carrying this burden. You don't have to be alone in this." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Kyra's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Jason thought she might push him away. But instead, she stayed silent, her gaze flickering over his face, as though she were trying to read him, trying to figure out if he was being sincere. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," Kyra admitted softly. her voice trembling just a little. I've been let down too many times. I've seen too many people fail, and I'm not sure I can take it if I let someone in and they leave. Jason's heart twisted at her words. He had known that Kyra was closed off, but hearing her speak so openly about her fears made him realize just how deep her scars ran. She had been through so much, and it wasn't just the factory that had hurt her. It was the system, the people who had used her, who had never truly seen her. I'm not going to leave you, Kyra, Jason said firmly. I'm not like them. I won't walk away. There was a long silence between them, and Jason could feel the weight of her gaze on him. He wasn't sure if she believed him yet, but he meant every word. He would prove it to her no matter how long it took. Kyra didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned back toward the control panel, her fingers lightly tracing over the surface. Jason watched her, unsure of what to say next. He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but he didn't want to push her too far, too fast. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kyra spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Why are you really here, Jake?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "What's your real reason for being on the factory floor? You're not like the others. You don't belong here." Jason hesitated, his mind racing. He had known this moment would come. He had known that eventually, Kyra would realize that there was more to him than just the friendly factory worker. She was too sharp, too perceptive to ignore the truth forever. "I'm here because I need to understand the truth," Jason said slowly, his voice honest. "I'm here because I'm trying to fix something that's broken. The system here, it's corrupt, Kyra, and I want to change it. I want to make things better. But I need your help." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze searching his face. She was studying him, trying to decipher his words, trying to decide if she could trust him with the truth. "You want to fix it?" she repeated, her voice skeptical. "How?" Jason took a deep breath. He had been holding this secret for weeks, and now it was time to let it out. He didn't know how Kyra would react, but he knew that it was the only way forward. "I'm the CEO of the company," Jason said quietly, watching for her reaction. "I've been undercover, trying to figure out what's really going on, and I need your help to expose the truth." For a moment, there was complete silence. Kyra's eyes widened in disbelief, and Jason could see the shock register on her face. It was clear that she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to be the one in charge. "You?" Kyra's voice faltered, her breath catching in her throat. "You're the CEO?" Jason nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just revealed his secret, and now there was no turning back. Kyra's expression froze, her yellow eyes wide in disbelief. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The weight of Jason's words hung in the air between them, an electric charge that neither of them knew how to navigate. Jason stood there, exposed in a way he hadn't planned for, but it was too late now. "I'm the CEO of the company," Jason repeated, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. "I came here undercover to figure out what was going wrong, to fix the system. I need your help, Kyra." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Kyra's gaze didn't waver, but her face was unreadable, her mouth tight as she processed what he had just revealed. Jason could see the shift in her eyes, the surprise, the betrayal. She had trusted him, maybe not completely, but enough to let her guard down just a little. And now that trust was shattered. "You're the CEO?" Kyra's voice was low, a mix of incredulity and something darker. "Hurt, maybe." Jason could hear the edge in her tone, but he wasn't sure how much of it was directed at him and how much of it was aimed at the system that had brought them both to this point. "This whole time, you've been lying to me?" Jason opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He hadn't expected this reaction, at least not so soon. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, he realized just how much he had underestimated the depth of Kyra's pain. He had put himself in her shoes, but he hadn't truly understood what she was carrying. How could he? He was the one in a position of power, and she was the one fighting for every scrap of dignity in a system designed to crush people like her. "Kyra, I wasn't lying to you," he said, his voice softer now, his hands held out in an attempt to calm her. I never meant to deceive you. I wanted to understand what was really going on. I needed to see it from the ground up, to understand what the workers go through, to see how bad things really are. Kyra shook her head, taking a step back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. You're telling me that you've been pretending to be one of us? You've been down here, working with us, all while you had this whole empire behind you. She scoffed, the bitterness creeping into her voice. How can you think I just forgive you for that? Jason's heart tightened. He understood her anger, her confusion. He had betrayed her trust, no matter how good his intentions had been. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, he said quietly, his voice edged with regret. But you have to believe me when I say that I want to change things. I'm not just here to play some game, Kyra. I'm here to fix this. Fix everything. Kyra scoffed again. But it wasn't a scoff of amusement. It was one of disbelief. She looked at him with a sharp, penetrating gaze, as if trying to peel away his facade, to see if there was any truth in what he said. Fix things? You've been part of this system your whole life. You've benefited from it. You don't get to suddenly play the hero, Jake. You don't get to come in here, pretend to be one of us, and then drop this bombshell on me and expect me to jump on board with your little reform plan. Her words stung, cutting deeper than Jason had expected. The anger in her eyes burned, and for a moment, he wondered if he had ruined everything. But he couldn't back down now. He couldn't let her walk away without at least trying to explain himself. I know I've been a part of it, he said, his voice tight but earnest. But I'm not the same person I was when I took on this job. I've seen how broken everything is, how the people at the top don't care about anyone but themselves. They don't care about you, Kyra. They don't care about the workers who are struggling to survive. I want to change that. I want to make this place better for people like you. Kyra's gaze softened slightly, but she was still guarded, still hesitant to trust him. Jason could see the internal battle raging behind her eyes, the push and pull of hope and fear. He could tell that part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he was different, that he could fix what had been broken for so long. But the other part of her, the part that had been burned by too many promises, was afraid to let herself trust again. I don't know if I can believe you, she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore. And you're the CEO. You have power, Jake. You have the ability to change things, but you don't know what it's like to fight for scraps. You don't know what it's like to wake up every day just hoping you'll survive long enough to see another one. Jason took a step closer, his heart aching at her words. He had never been on the other side of this struggle, never known what it felt like to fight for every meal, every hour of rest, every breath of air. He had never known what it meant to be truly vulnerable, to be at the mercy of people who didn't care. But Kyra was showing him, bit by bit, and he was starting to understand. I don't know what it's like, Kyra, he said, his voice low. But I want to learn. I want to understand. I'm not going to change things from the top down. I want to do it with you, alongside you. I can't do it without people like you. Without your voice. She didn't respond right away, but Jason could see the conflict written on her face. She was torn, and it wasn't just because of the company or the system. It was because of him. She was afraid to let him get too close, afraid of what might happen if she trusted him too much. I've been alone for a long time, she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know how to let people in anymore. Jason took another step forward, his voice gentle but insistent. You don't have to do this alone, Kyra. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm asking you to help me. We can do this together. Kyra was silent for a long moment, her brow furrowed as she processed his words. Jason waited, his breath held, unsure of what her decision would be. He had already taken a huge risk by revealing who he was, but he wasn't ready to walk away yet, not when there was still a chance. Finally, Kyra looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. I don't know if I can trust you, she said quietly, her voice heavy with doubt. But I'll help you. If you really want to change things, then I'll help you. But don't expect me to just forget what you've done. Jason nodded, relief flooding through him. Though he knew they still had a long way to go, he wasn't going to win her trust overnight. But this was a start. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I promise, Kyra. I won't let you down." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and for the first time, Jason felt like they were on the same side. He didn't know how this would all unfold, but for the first time since he had started his mission, he felt like there was a real chance of making a difference. As they stood there, the tension between them slowly beginning to ease, Jason knew that this was only the beginning. There was so much work to be done, and they still had a long road ahead of them. But for the first time, the weight of the company's corruption felt like something they could fight against together. The days that followed the confrontation between Jason and Kyra were a blur. The tension between them hadn't completely disappeared, but there was an unspoken understanding that hung in the air, a fragile thread that connected them despite everything that had happened. Jason had expected this, knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, but there were moments when the distance between them seemed insurmountable. Kyra's behavior had changed. She wasn't cold anymore, but she was distant, careful with every word she spoke to him. They spent their days working side by side, the tension between them an almost tangible presence. Jason did everything he could to prove himself, trying not to be overbearing, trying not to push her too much. He was learning to wait, to be patient, but he was also starting to understand just how much damage the system had done to people like Kyra. She had been burned by promises before, by false hope, by people who had told her they wanted to help, only to abandon her when it suited them. And that was exactly why he couldn't give up. He had to prove to her that he wasn't like those people, that he wasn't just another corporate suit who would disappear once the work was done. On the fourth day after their talk, Jason found himself in a meeting with his team, the same team that had been running the company from behind the scenes, the same team that had been pulling the strings without care for the people who actually kept the business running. Jason had kept his identity secret for so long, but now that Kyra knew, the pressure of maintaining his ruse felt almost unbearable. He couldn't pretend anymore. "All right, we're here to discuss the next phase of our new project," Ethan, one of his senior executives, said, flipping through a stack of digital reports. "We're going to need to make some adjustments to the budget. We've been overextended in the last quarter, and we need to start cutting costs. Maybe some layoffs." Jason's blood ran cold at the word, but he kept his face impassive. The fact that this was still the conversation after everything he had seen and learned over the past few days made his stomach churn. "There's no room for layoffs," Jason said firmly, his voice carrying more weight than he'd intended. "No more cutting corners on the backs of workers." Ethan blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me? I said no layoffs," Jason repeated, feeling a surge of authority that surprised him. For the first time since he'd stepped into this room as the CEO, he felt like he might actually be able to change something. "We're going to find another way. We'll figure out how to restructure. But no one loses their job on my watch." The other executives exchanged confused glances. Ethan looked like he was about to argue, but Jason didn't give him the chance. "I don't care how you've been doing things, but we're going to start doing things differently. We're going to make this company accountable to the people who work here." He turned his gaze around the table, his eyes locking with each executive in turn. "If you're not on board with that, I'm happy to find someone who is." The room went silent, the weight of Jason's words hanging in the air. For a moment, it felt like they were all frozen, unsure of how to proceed. And then, finally, Ethan cleared his throat, a nervous smile tugging at his lips. "All right, Jason," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "We'll find another way." Jason nodded, but his satisfaction was short-lived. He knew this was only a small victory. The real challenge would come when the changes started to take effect. He couldn't just change the way they did business from one meeting. It would take time, it would take strategy, and most of all, it would take trust, both from his team and from the workers who were counting on him to follow through. Later that day, when Jason returned to the office, he found Kyra at her desk, her focus on the report in front of her. He paused for a moment, watching her, knowing she would have heard the fallout from the meeting, knowing she would have heard his stance on the layoffs. She looked up when she saw him standing there, but there was no warmth in her expression. She was still guarded, still holding herself back from fully opening up to him. He understood that they were still walking a fine line between ally and betrayer, and Jason wasn't sure where they would land. "How did the meeting go?" Kyra asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes never leaving his face. Jason leaned against the doorframe, trying to read her. "We're not doing layoffs," he said simply. "I've made it clear that we're not cutting jobs. We're going to find other ways to make the company sustainable." Kyra didn't smile, but her eyes softened ever so slightly. "That's a good start," she said quietly. "But it's going to take more than that, Jason. You can't just make one decision and expect everything to change." "I know," he said, his voice sincere. "I'm in this for the long haul. I'm not going to back down. But I need your help, Kyra. I need you to keep pushing me, even when I don't get it right, even when I mess up." Kyra looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And then, for the first time since the revelation of his true identity, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice quieter now, softer. "I'll help you, but you're going to have to prove that you mean it." Jason didn't answer right away. He didn't know if he could prove it overnight, but he knew that this was the first real step toward earning her trust. "I will," he promised. "I swear." As the days passed, Jason worked tirelessly alongside Kyra and the other employees, trying to implement his changes, trying to navigate the bureaucracy and the resistance that came with it. It was slow, grueling work, and there were setbacks along the way, but every small victory, every bit of progress, felt like a triumph. And through it all, Kyra was there. Quiet, supportive, and always questioning, always pushing him to be better, to do more. But as the tension began to ease between them, another threat loomed on the horizon. Jason knew that there were still those in the company who wouldn't let him change things so easily, and he had a sinking feeling that he wasn't out of the woods yet. Still, for the first time, he felt hopeful. And as he caught Kyra's eye across the office one evening, a faint smile tugging at her lips, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they were building something worth fighting for. But the road ahead would not be easy, and they both knew it. The weeks that followed felt like a race against time. Every day, Jason faced new challenges, many of them more difficult than he had imagined. As he worked tirelessly to change the company's structure, he found himself pulled in multiple directions. Managing the executives who were still reluctant to accept the new direction, making sure the employees felt heard and valued, and, most of all, keeping the growing connection with Kyra alive without pushing her too far. Though their bond had started to heal after the rocky revelation, there were still moments when Kyra's walls seemed too high for him to breach. Jason understood the hesitation, the way she would look at him sometimes, as though unsure whether he was truly capable of doing what he had promised. But he had also learned something invaluable, that his sincerity wasn't enough on its own. He needed to show her, through every action, that he was capable of being the man he had promised to become. It was late one evening when Kyra approached him in the break room, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as she leaned against the counter, arms folded. Jason had been working long hours, his face showing the faintest signs of exhaustion, but he still managed to smile when she walked in. "I need you to do something for me," Kyra said, her voice carrying a quiet urgency. There was something in her eyes, a glimmer of resolve mixed with uncertainty. Jason looked up from his paperwork, meeting her gaze. "What is it?" "I need you to address the team," she said bluntly. "The ones at the top. I need you to be honest with them about what's really going on, about how they've been running things. We've made progress, but I can see the cracks. We need real transparency from the top." Jason paused, his brow furrowing. The idea of standing before the board and executives, many of whom had been with the company for years, felt like a daunting task. But he knew Kyra was right. She was always right when it came to these matters. "Are you sure they'll listen?" he asked cautiously. "They don't have a choice," Kyra replied. "You've already made some moves, Jason, but now you need to show them you're serious. You need to take control, not just for the workers but for your own sake. They'll never respect you if they think you're just playing their game." Jason's heart pounded at her words. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about his integrity, about proving to himself and everyone around him that he wasn't going to buckle under the pressure. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. But this was the next step. This was the challenge he had been waiting for. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "You're right. It's time to take a stand." The next morning, Jason stood before the board of directors, his mind racing as he glanced at the faces of the people who had built the company on the backs of workers like Kyra. There was no turning back now. He had to be the leader they needed, not the one they expected. "Thank you all for gathering today," Jason began, his voice surprisingly calm, considering the storm brewing inside him. "I know I've made some changes recently, but today, I'm here to address the real issues. The ones that have been ignored for too long." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but Jason didn't waver. He had to take control, to show them that he was capable of more than just issuing orders from behind a desk. "The truth is, the system we've built here has been flawed from the start. We've prioritized profits over people, growth over fairness, and efficiency over the well-being of our employees," Jason continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "That stops now." One of the senior executives, a man named David, raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And how do you intend to fix that, Jason? You've only been in charge for a few weeks. Are we supposed to just throw everything we've worked for out the window?" Jason met his gaze, unwavering. "No, we don't throw anything out. We build something better. But it means we have to change the way we think, the way we operate. We need to treat our employees with the respect they deserve, not as expendable assets." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Jason could see that some of the board members were beginning to understand the gravity of what he was saying, while others were growing increasingly uncomfortable. But there was no turning back now. "I'm not asking you to abandon everything you've built. I'm asking you to evolve," Jason said, his voice commanding. "We can make the necessary changes to secure this company's future, but only if we start with transparency, fairness, and, most importantly, respect for the people who make this company run." There was a long pause. Then, to Jason's surprise, one of the younger executives, a woman named Elena, spoke up. "I agree with Jason," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "If we want to continue growing, we need to invest in our people. We can't keep treating them like they're disposable. We've already seen the consequences of that approach." Jason turned to her, a flicker of hope rising in his chest. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. If he could get even one person on his side, it was a step forward. The rest of the meeting continued, and though there were still many points of disagreement, Jason felt a shift in the room. For the first time, he could see that some of the people who had once been so entrenched in the old ways were starting to consider the possibility of change. As the meeting ended, Jason felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. He had said what needed to be said, and though he knew the road ahead would still be difficult, he had taken the first steps toward real transformation. He hadn't backed down, and neither had Kyra. Later that evening, Jason found Kyra sitting at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she looked at the papers in front of her. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, there was a hint of expectation in her eyes. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. Jason smiled, though it was tinged with fatigue. "It went well. Better than I expected, actually. I think we've made a breakthrough." Kyra's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Good. You took the first step. But don't get complacent." Jason chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "I won't. Not after everything that's happened. I've learned a lot." Kyra leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening for a moment before she caught herself. "I didn't think you had it in you," she said, her voice laced with a mix of admiration and wariness. "You proved me wrong. But this is just the beginning. There's still so much more to do." Jason nodded, his expression turning serious. "I know. And I can't do it without you, Kyra. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for your help, your guidance." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, there was silence between them, neither of them moving. both of them aware of the fragile bond they had started to rebuild. "I'm in," Kyra said finally, her voice steady. "But we're not done yet. We've only just started." Jason's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and determination. They were in this together now. There was no going back. The weeks that followed the meeting with the board were a whirlwind of progress and challenges. Jason had made a bold promise to the employees of the company, and now he was determined to follow through. His commitment to transparency, to treating people as more than mere cogs in the machine, was slowly beginning to take root. But the battle was far from over. Kyra was by his side through it all, her influence and wisdom guiding him. She had become more than just a colleague to him. She was a partner in this revolution, someone who understood the inner workings of the company better than anyone else. As much as Jason had grown over the past few months, he knew he still had so much to learn. He relied on Kyra's insight, and in turn, he began to earn her trust. But even as the company's operations improved, the threat of sabotage still lingered. The old guard, those who had benefited from the previous exploitative structure, were not going to go down without a fight. They whispered among themselves, meeting in secret, plotting ways to undermine Jason's efforts. They knew he was a threat to everything they had built. One night, Jason was in his office, going over reports, when he received an unexpected message. It was from Kyra, her name flashing across his screen. The subject line read, "We need to talk." Jason's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for her to send him messages late at night, but there was an urgency in the tone that made him uneasy. He quickly opened the message. It was brief but direct. "I need you to meet me in the storage room on the lower floor." Now, Jason didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and made his way through the empty halls, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the building. His mind raced with questions. What could this be about? Was it something with the company, or something more personal? When he reached the storage room, he found the door ajar. He pushed it open cautiously, and there she was, standing in the dim light, her face tense with worry. "Kyra?" Jason said softly, stepping inside. "What's going on?" She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room before they finally settled on him. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "Something that could destroy everything you've been working for." Jason's stomach dropped. He closed the door behind him, a cold sense of dread creeping in. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Kyra hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously toward the door before she spoke again. "I found out something today. There are people in this company, people you trust, who are working against you. They've been sabotaging the changes you've been trying to make. They've been leaking information to the media, spreading lies, and doing everything they can to make you look like a failure." Jason's breath hitched. He had known that resistance was inevitable, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply entrenched it was. He had thought the battle was mostly over, that he had won the support of the company, that they were all in this together. But now, it seemed the true enemy was even closer than he had feared. "Who?" Jason demanded, his voice barely a whisper as anger simmered beneath the surface. "Who's behind this?" Kyra's eyes darkened. "It's someone from your inner circle. I've been doing some digging and I found a connection between David, your senior executive, and the group that's been leaking information. He's been working behind the scenes to discredit you." Jason's fists clenched at his sides. The betrayal stung in a way he hadn't expected. David had been one of the executives who had initially agreed to support his changes, but now Jason saw the truth for what it was. David had been playing a dangerous game all along. "Is there any way to stop him?" Jason asked, his voice low, controlled. "I think we can, but we have to act fast. He's already made plans to have you removed from the board," Kyra explained. "If we don't expose him now, it could be too late. The media is already picking up on the rumors he's been feeding them." Jason's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. He had trusted David, had seen him as an ally, and now he realized how wrong he had been. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating. He felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered by a deeper sense of resolve. This was his company, his vision. He couldn't let one man, no matter how powerful, tear it all down. We have to expose him, Jason said firmly, his voice gaining strength. We'll gather the evidence and go straight to the board. I won't let him destroy everything we've worked for. Kyra nodded, her expression determined. I'm with you, but we need to be careful. If we go public with this too soon, it could backfire. Jason met her gaze, his mind already formulating a plan. We'll do this the right way. We'll get the proof, and then we'll make sure David has nowhere to hide. Over the next few days, Jason and Kyra worked in secret, gathering all the evidence they could. Kyra had her sources, people on the inside who had witnessed David's dealings and were willing to speak out. Jason, meanwhile, used his own access to the company's systems to find the emails and communications that would prove David's betrayal. It was a tense, exhausting few days, but they didn't falter. They knew the stakes were too high. When they finally had everything they needed, Jason called an emergency meeting with the board. His heart pounded as he walked into the conference room, the faces of the board members staring back at him. He knew some of them were still loyal to David, still influenced by his power. But Jason wasn't going to back down. Not now. We have a serious issue, Jason began, his voice steady as he placed a stack of files on the table. One of you has been sabotaging this company, leaking information, spreading lies, and trying to discredit everything we've worked for. The room went silent. Jason could feel the tension rise as he met the eyes of the executives. Then, slowly, he opened the files and began to reveal the evidence. The emails, the meeting notes, the hidden communications that tied David directly to the sabotage. David's face turned pale as the truth came to light. He sputtered in disbelief, trying to deny everything. But the evidence was undeniable. The room was in chaos as board members began to argue. Some were furious, others shocked, but all of them knew that the truth had come out. David's grip on the company was slipping, and there was no way he could recover from this. In the end, Jason's decision was clear. David was removed from the board, his reputation shattered. The company, for all its flaws, had a chance at redemption. And Jason had proven, once and for all, that he wasn't just a CEO. He was a leader who would fight for what was right. As the meeting ended, Jason turned to Kyra, his heart swelling with gratitude. Without her, none of this would have been possible. You did it, she said quietly, a small but genuine smile on her face. We did it. Jason smiled back, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was truly on the right path. Together, they had rebuilt something broken, and now they could finally move forward together.